In this video, we're going to write out our first example using state. Now, just as a quick disclaimer here, we're going to first write out a little example that's not going to be quite correct. I know it's really confusing anytime someone shows you the wrong way to do something when you're first learning it, but I'm doing this for a very particular reason that you'll see very shortly. So we're going to first write out some slightly incorrect code, and then we're going to fix it right away. And I'll be really sure to tell you exactly what is incorrect about it. All right, so back inside of my counter screen component, I'm going to first begin by adding in two button elements. So I'll add in a button right here, and I'll give it a title prop. So this first one will be increase our counter. I'll then duplicate that down, and the second one will be decrease. All right, next up, I'm going to declare a new variable at the top of our function. I'm going to say let counter, and I'll give it a starting value of 0 like so. So this right here, this is the first line I'm going to write. This is not quite correct to initialize a piece of state. So we're going to come back. I'll say to do, fix this. Again, I want to show you this example with some slightly incorrect code for a very particular reason. Now we had said that anytime a user taps on this button or this button, we want to modify the value of counter. So we want to increase it by 1 or decrease it by 1. To do so, we will add up an onPress prop to our increase component. I'll give this thing an arrow function, and I'm going to give it a body, so I'll put in a set of curly braces, and then inside of here, I'll put a new line and say counter plus plus. Remember what counter does. Plus plus does. That increments a variable by 1. And then I'll repeat the same thing for decrease as well. So I'll write in an arrow function with a body, and I'll put in counter minus minus. And then finally, inside this text element right here, I'm going to add in counter or current count, and then I'll print out the current value of counter inside there. Okay, so let's save this right here. Once again, this is not going to work as expected, but I want you to see exactly what happens. So I'm going to flip back over, I'm going to go to the counter demo, and then I'll click on increase and decrease, and of course, nothing actually happens here. So why is that? Well, essentially, inside of a React component, we can reference variables like this all day. And behind the scenes, the value of counter really is changing. For example, inside of this first onPress right here, right after I do the counter increment, I could do a console log of counter. And I can do another one on the second onPress as well. Console log counter down here as well. So I'm going to save this, and I'll retry this really quickly. So I'll hit increase a couple times, and then decrease a couple times. I'll then go back over to my terminal, and I can very easily see that we have had some console logs here. And every time the counter variable has either increased or decreased, depending on which button I hit. So why didn't the screen actually update? Well, it's a very simple reason. By default, React does not just kind of magically watch a variable and say, hey, whenever this variable changes, I'm just going to magically update. There's no automatic detection of some variable changing inside of our components. So instead, when we add in a piece of state, as our counter is supposed to be, we're going to instead use a little function from React. This function that we're going to use to create a state variable is going to have this kind of magic step built in for us. When we create a variable with this magic little function from React, React is going to automatically watch the value of that variable, and whenever we change it, React is going to automatically update the content on our screen. Okay, so that's the end of the bad code that we've now written out. Let's now replace some of this bad code with good stuff that's actually going to work appropriately. So to get started, up at the top from React, I'm going to import useState. useState is what we refer to as a hook. A hook is a function that adds some new functionality to a function component, which is what we are using right here. We can use this useState function to make a very special kind of variable that React is going to essentially watch. And anytime we update its value, it's going to automatically update our component on the screen. Now, with the useState, we're going to use that to initialize our piece of state here, as opposed to doing a normal variable declaration. So I'm going to delete the let counter. I'm also going to delete the fix this. And then instead, I'm going to write out const. I'm going to use a little bit of weird syntax here, so I'm going to put in some square brackets, and I'll say counter, and then set counter equals useState, like so. And then into useState, I'm going to enter in as a first argument 0. Okay, so there's a lot going here on this line right here. So let's break down what's happening. First off, when we call useState, I passed in a Z value of 0. We're using useState to initialize a new piece of state or a new piece of data that we're going to track. Remember, we made a big point in these diagrams we looked at over here about talking about what the data's starting or default value is. Whenever we call useState, we're going to pass in the starting value or the default value of that piece of data. So in this case, I put in 0 right here because I want my counter to have an initial value of 0. Next up, on the left-hand side of this equal sign, what are those square brackets right there? Well, this is what we refer to as array destructuring. This is another way of pulling some elements or a reference to elements out of an array. Let's flip back over to our browser really quick, and I'll write out a quick example to show you exactly what's going on with that. Okay, so I'm going to use my browser, or the console inside of it, just to give you a very quick example here. I'm going to declare a new array called colors, and I'll give it a value of red and green like so. I can now access different elements inside that array by writing out simply colors at 0 or colors at 1. But another way that I could do this, if I wanted to take both the first and second elements out of there and assign them to a variable all in one step, I could write out const color1 and color2 equals colors. So this is essentially saying, hey JavaScript, we understand that colors is an array. So we want you to take the first element out of colors and assign it to the variable color1, and then the second element out of colors and assign it to the variable color2. The variable names right here of color1 and color2, they can be anything we want. So I'll run that, and now if I print out color1, I'll see red, and color2 is green. So the syntax you see back over here, this array destructuring, we're only using because it just gives us a slightly easier time of accessing whatever useState returns to us. Okay, so now inside of here, we've got a counter variable. This is our piece of state that's going to change over time. Now here's the one catch, the one thing you need to be aware of. Anytime we want to update or change this piece of state, we're never going to modify the counter variable directly. This counter plus plus right here will modify the counter variable directly, and we don't want to do that. As I mentioned, React is not magic. It's not going to somehow detect magically that we change that variable. So this is bad right here, and I'll put in a comment that says, don't do this. We don't modify a state variable directly. Instead, anytime we want to change a state variable, we're going to use the second thing that comes back to us when we call useState. This is a function called setCounter. Anytime we want to update our piece of state, we're going to call that function right there with the new value that we want counter to be. So in other words, inside of our first button right here, anytime we click or tap on that button, I'm going to remove the console log. Inside of here, we probably want to increase the value of counter. So to do so, we can use the setCounter function. So I will call setCounter, and I'll say counter plus 1. Now notice when I call counter plus 1 right here, that doesn't modify counter. In other words, adding 1 to a number doesn't change that variable. We're just using its current value, we're adding 1 to it, and that returns a new value that does not get assigned back to counter. I can now do the same thing down here in the second button as well. So I'm going to delete everything inside of onPress and replace it with setCounter, counter minus 1. Anytime we call the setCounter function, React is going to automatically rerun this entire function component we have created. So the entire counter screen component, like everything inside of here, is going to be executed again. But the second time it gets executed, the value of counter right here will now be whatever we passed into setCounter. So in this case, counter plus 1 or counter minus 1. Okay, so I'm doing a lot of talking here. Let's just save this and see what happens. So I'll save the file. I'll go to the counter demo, and now I can click on increase, and I'll see the current count increase by 1, and decrease will make it decrease by 1. Now, learning state for the very first time is usually pretty darn confusing. So at this point, everything inside of here, if this looks kind of confusing, don't sweat it, because as I mentioned, we're going to go over several examples exactly like this to help you understand exactly what's going on. So let's take a quick pause right here. In the next video, we will do a quick review of the code we just wrote, and then we will start on a second little example with state.